This is sort of work that's coming out of an ongoing project, research project that I'm working on the history and sort of future of live art in Scotland. And sort of what I want to do with my time is to think about how we might try and historicize some of the kind of COVID-safe theatre practices that perhaps we've been talking about today, but other examples as well, to sort of call attention to maybe patterns of experimentation and innovation which have existed during but either side of lockdown as well. So it's thinking about alternatives which perhaps already have a history to them, which already exist. And so my interest is not to try and claim that live art got there first, but to use live art as a sort of field of practice or as offering a perspective for thinking about and questioning some of the normative habits of theatre production, to which I think a lot of institutions are now returning. I'm really conscious that I think a lot of us have experienced a sort of double anxiety at any number of moments since January 2020. This sort of one, which is linked to a sense of like preemptive loss, which is, oh no, what if things are never the same again? And then not long after it, there was also this sort of sense of anticipation, which was, oh no, what if things go back to how they were before? And I feel like holding both of those perspectives in mind is really important, particularly at this moment, like right now, when it feels like formal COVID measures are going to be lifted and there's going to be the suspension of things like access to free lateral flow testing, certainly in England, and then presumably in Wales and Scotland not long after. And knowing that that will have a disproportionate effect on people who are already marginalised from cultural participation, particularly people who are clinically vulnerable, for example. Before I go any further, I should offer a really brief definition of what I mean by live art. So I'm talking about a body of interdisciplinary and experimental arts practice that comes out of the late 80s, particularly in the context of the UK. And it's sort of the meeting point of artists who are visual artists coming away from object-based practices of sculpture and painting, but also performance makers who are coming away from a literary dramatic tradition. And so it becomes this interdisciplinary space, which is also including artists who are working across the boundaries of dance and film and video and performance art and public art. And the ecology of that work has really been dominated since the late 1980s by festival models of curation and presentation. And I think what's interesting is that they've operated to create both material and critical contexts in which experimental work might be staged. And so the most famous example of this is the National Review of Live Art, which ran for 30 years until 2010. But kind of ongoing examples include things like Spill, Fierce Festival and Tempting Failure, which are all in England, Experimentica, which is in Cardiff, and in Scotland, Take Me Somewhere Festival. So in historicising the figure of the performance curator, Florian Malzacher talks about or emphasises contexts, links between artists, artworks, audiences, cultures, social and political realities, parallel worlds, discourses and institutions. And I think those last two terms, discourses and institutions, are at the heart of what live art is, or what live art is trying to do, or the claims made for live art. So another scholar writing about performance curation talks about Lois Keaton's work as the head of the Live Art Development Agency. She was the co-founder of it, and the way in which she sort of has deployed live art as a cultural and financial strategy. So it's become a term which has basically unlocked access to arts funding to a lot of experimental artists by giving them a language through which they can articulate their practice. While also, it's sort of paved the way for a critical framework that might emphasize both the live and the interdisciplinary. So sort of my route into that field for the purposes of this is a cluster worked in and around the genre of auto theatre, which have unfolded during the pandemic. And these are works which are intended to be performed by their audiences, most often in the absence of professional performers. I'm interested in them because of how they advertise sort of small-scale solutions to the problem of liveness, as well as the rhetoric around them suggests our sense of what might be lost or recovered in their action. So I'm thinking here of works by artists like Kolbrun Bjort's Sigfusdottir, a recent show called Deliverance, which was produced by a Scotland-based company called Vanishing Point. It's a solo show with your own personal soundtrack that begins when a person arrives at your door with an envelope containing the script. It's a set of instructions that you will follow for the next 90 minutes by yourself. You'll dress up, you'll dance, you'll pose in the mirror, you'll receive a phone call from a stranger, but don't worry, no one will be watching you. That's a quote from their website. Interviewed by Joyce Macmillan for the Scotsman newspaper, Sigfusdottir framed the work in terms of a permission structure, quote, like the permission you get when you attend a theatre show, to just step away from your screen and your life for a while and see things differently. While the artists maintain that the work is not the same as live theatre, of course, they suggested that, quote, The fact that something is physically delivered to your home will make it feel like a little touch, a reminder of that same sense of physical presence you get in theatre. And although each audience member will be alone, they will know they will know that other people, about 10 at a time, are going through the same experience at roughly the same time. And I'm hoping that will generate a sense of the audience taking a journey together, as we always do in the theatre. So one of the things that maybe we're being invited to think about there is a reorientation of liveness towards what we might call eventness. And I was thinking about how the word event was being used so far today. And maybe what we're talking about here is our apprehension of an investment in, and perhaps even nostalgia for, what theatre might have to offer as a communal event. I think we can put this example in conversation with the practice of artists like Ant Hampton and his work with or as Roto Zaza in making shows like Etiquette, which is a work that takes the form of a half-hour experience for two people in a public space. No one is watching. Other people in the space don't know that you're performing, but you're wearing headphones which tell you what to say and what to do. And the work unfolds in that live moment of exchange. We might also be thinking about the work, an audio work by US artist 600 Highwayman. It's a series of works called 1,000 Ways, the first one of which a phone call I encountered during Take Me Somewhere Festival in spring 2021, when lockdown meant that the entire program was online. This work takes the form of a phone call with an unnamed stranger, another audience member, in which you're guided by an automated voice, or what sounds like an automated voice, into a scenario where you're lost in the desert and sitting around a campfire, though the prompts seem to shift between inviting connection and prompting evasiveness. This is the first in a triptych of works which are encounters between strangers. In the second installment, you sit opposite a stranger on a table bisected by glass. In the third, it's a public convention between you and all the other people who've been on the journey of these three works, and that takes place live and in person, a final collective experience. I'm interested in how these works' varied forms might advertise a longer-standing, pre-pandemic interest amongst live art and experimental theatre makers in questioning what theatre takes for granted, or more pointedly, what we think we value when we value theatre, when we defend theatre, when we lobby for support for theatre. At this point, I want to highlight another AHRC project called Walking Publics, Walking Arts, led by my colleague Dee Hedden at University of Glasgow. And this is a project which has involved cataloguing how artists have used walking as part of their work during COVID-19, whether as a familiar resource or a new opportunity, along with a series of commissions which are attempting to mitigate some of the barriers to walking identified in the research. I'm flagging that project because I recently, it was sort of flagged as the first piece of theatre when we first came out of lockdown last year in Scotland. It was a series of what were called chalk walks, created by a site-specific performance maker, Ben Harrison, who's perhaps better known as the co-director of Gridiron, who made a whole series of site-specific works, most famously perhaps a show called Decky Does a Bronco, which was made for children's playgrounds. So a chalk walk is a walk where you and a companion take a walk, stopping occasionally to make chalk markings on pavements and walls. Described by theatre critic Mark Brown as theatre pared back to the very fundamentals of live human interaction, the work centres on an unscripted encounter with a performer who, and I'll quote Joyce Macmillan again, who is not so much an actor as another human being. I like her distinction there between human beings and actors. I don't think that's quite what she meant, but it's still funny. It's the work that begins with you standing in a chalk square. At the time, it was 2 meters apart from the other chalk square, because that was the regulatory distance. And the square is marked with your name and the name of the other audience member, the other name of the performer. And it follows a relatively unstructured form. It's an hour-long conversation with a stranger. Reviewing the work for the stage, Fergus Morgan wrote of his experience, "We chat about family, about the city, about extreme sports. Sometimes we stop and draw something. She reads me a poem, Edinburgh by Alfred Noyes, as we loiter on a bridge over the water of Leith." It's lovely, but what is it? It's not a show. It's not even a performance apart from the poem bit. You could overanalyze it and call it an open-ended exercise in connection, a free-form attempt to re-establish trust in each other after a rocky year, and you'd be right. It is both these things. That's the end of that review. I'm interested in how we might put Harrison's chalk walking conversation with another earlier and I think more carefully structured walking piece by another Scotland-based artist, Rosanna Cade, called Walking Holding, first staged in 2013. This is a piece in which you walk in public spaces with a series of strangers, with the key difference being that the work centers on or begins with the invitation to walk holding hands. Originally intended as an exploration of their own experiences of holding hands with their partner in public, and in so address the experiences of people who face public harassment or discrimination because of their gender presentation or sexual identity, the work has developed to become a broader exploration of the terms of shared intimacy in public. And so it's been staged in various different cities across the UK and internationally, and each time the route is chosen to reflect a different set of public encounters and different senses of publicness, public squares, busy shopping streets, or quieter alleys that bring with them different understandings of exposure and privacy. There are a few lines of flight that we might follow here, thinking about the different registers of walking and talking in public as conferring new agency at this moment, or as involving an encounter whose terms are partially under our control as audience members. We might also be thinking about how both works invite us to reassess our sense of theatre as involving an experience of being in common, asking us to consider who is actually here and the register of risk that might be associated with here-ness and close proximity before, during, and whatever might resemble after the pandemic. Now, the thread running through what I've been talking about so far is the status of solo or one-to-one performance, and I think it's essential that we recognize the political economy of that particular field of practice. Now, at a sort of basic level, we might see these works at this time as being the response to the risk posed by crowds. Yeah, so you just reduce the number of people involved in any one encounter. And we might also think about them or imagine them to be cheap, but I think we want to be really careful about the turn to cheap or cheaper forms of performance making, or without recognizing how they are really broadly incompatible with box office logics, which turn on the expectation, put very crudely, that there are more people in the audience than are on the stage, and that the work can be reproduced to scale, which means doing it again and again and again and again. Deborah Pearson, a theatre maker and founder of Forest Fringe, notes that even when tickets are bought and sold, one-on-one performance remains one of the most financially unsustainable forms of theatre. And observes playwright David Grieg's reported comments that one-to-one might be considered decadent as a resource-hungry form of theatre that makes its experiences to few rather than many at the time of constraint on resource. It's not incidental, I think, that one-to-one performances have tended to flourish in the exceptional circumstances of festivals intended to resist or frustrate commercial logics for theatre making, things like Forest Fringe's Edinburgh programme. And these are circumstances in which artists, I think, have tried to make a claim on the non-monetary value of performance in festivals. And so I find myself thinking about the pandemic as an ongoing series of exceptional circumstances. What new economies of value are we falling into, or are we insisting on? I should offer something like a conclusion so I can wrap up this talk, and without going wildly over my time. In Scotland, the Take Me Somewhere Festival, which I've mentioned and I've been involved with a bit, they're a festival of live art and contemporary performance. And they cancelled their planned programme entirely in 2020 and came back in 2021 with a fully online event presented in Glasgow and everywhere, as they marketed it. Sorry, there's pictures of clouds there, of chalk walks there. So they came back with a programme in 2021, which included digital versions of shows, such as Caden McCaskill's The Making of Pinocchio, which had been first conceived as in-person events, but which were very slowly and carefully redeveloped for screen presentation. And one of the ways in which Take Me Somewhere tried to create or sustain a sense of eventness was by saying that all of these events will happen at once. There was no watch again facility, which obviously excluded some people from being able to access the events, but that was the choice that they made. And they also had a virtual theatre lobby with a DJ where you could hang out before and after shows. There was, though, one in-person event. This was an outdoor public art installation called Future Perfect, a collaboration between UK performance makers Action Hero and Canadian visual artists Mia and Eric. It's an intervention in public space which takes some local bylaws, in this instance Paisley's rule for the management of public parks, and offers them as a text by which you might create a new set of rules for a transitioning world. So if you go to the project's website, it's kind of automatically looping and generating these sort of reconfigurations of fragments of the text. And these were installed in spaces in Paisley. So you might just be able to make out that sign there that says, this area is for an informal and legitimately organized performance event. In her recent book, Theatre of Lockdown, Barbara Fuchs turns to distance theatre and exploring strategies deployed in making performance safely or safer. And a longer version of this paper would trace examples of a lot of what she talks about how promenade and distance forms are taking advantage of built-in distancing. I'd be basically tracking all of those to an expanded field of live art. So like that's maybe my homework, is to actually do that, because that's presumably what my project might be doing. But I did say at the start of this, I wasn't going to simply argue that live art got there first, wherever there might be. Writing from the context of the USA in the latter part of last year, Fuchs's closing argument is that, quote, in-person theatre seems very precarious, as the possibility of even distanced productions recedes before the reality of COVID-19's enduring reach. With vaccinations underway, the weight is now bounded, yet the resilience and adaptability of the theatre of lockdown seem more essential than ever. I'm really struck by that word resilience, not least because it's something that's become a key word in Arts Council discourse, and maybe some of the people working for venues can speak to the demand for resilience. And it's a term which has not just become an opportunity, but something that's been a kind of condition of funding, your ability to show you are resilient, that you can weather the storm. And because it's a concept that refers to the capacity of individuals and organizations to bounce back to stability, as well as to bounce forward to transformative growth triggered by adversity. But despite the emphasis on change, I think we need to remember that resilience is kind of normative insofar as what comes out signaling resilience is extremely sensitive to how persistence is understood. So in continuing to curate for liveness, what do we want to preserve or insist on sustaining for theatre? And what can we comfortably and maybe even eagerly leave behind? That's it. Done. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dave. Very interesting presentation and lovely thoughts indeed. I have 1,000 questions and thoughts I would like to share and ask you with regards to what you said. But, I will start with my last one. I was thinking that one of the most important elements that theatre and live theatre used to give to the audience is that feeling of privileged, the privilege that you were with the actors, with the artist and with the audience, you know, your co-audience when the actual event happened. Mm-hmm. Maybe because I come, my background is in drama and theatre as well. For me, this is, you know, a hype that I cannot exchange with anything. How do you feel that all these different solutions, do you think that all these different solutions give the audience this type of sensation? Is it, you mentioned something about that in the beginning of your presentation, but do you think it can replace or create a new sensation maybe of this type of togetherness? And
yeah, I think it's, I don't know that it's, my feeling is that the most successful practices have been ones which have not set out to replace that experience that you're talking about, and that have maybe tried to understand, well, like what the underlying thing might be, whether we call it togetherness, whether we call it communitas, and ask what is valuable about that, and then ask if that valuable can be accessed in another way. So I feel like a lot of these works, certainly the one-to-one ones, are very much attuned to the potential of intimacy and exchange and interaction that just simply wouldn't be accessible in a large auditorium full of people. So I think that when they've been successful, they've lent into like the conventions that they're working with, rather than going, we will try and give you the sensation of being in a crowd, but there's just two of us, or in fact, you're just there by yourself. They've sort of acknowledged that they are doing something else, and that something else might have value.
Thank you. Thank you. Sarah, I can see your hand raised, please.
Yeah, I think I've got a kind of academic question, so apologies for that. But in the beginning, you started, you know, your project is about historizing Is that the right word to
Yeah,
say?
historicizing, yeah.
What's actually now happening in the pandemic, kind of this, pandemic and restriction appropriated practices. And because my background is Fluxus and the neo-avant-garde, which also involves live arts, and of course, for them, happenings were mostly an idea to subvert the art market and the power relations there, and kind of really withdraw their creativity from that profit-making industry. And for me, it's very funny because in the pandemic now reincorporates this creative practice to survive, which of course is the opposite purpose of the initial agenda, so to speak. And I was wondering, because I assume you've got a bigger scope of live arts history than I have, which is kind of very Fluxus focused. So how did live arts come aboard, and was it a counter practice to to the industry and economy? And how do you feel it now? What did it become now?
I think it has a fairly complicated, I was going to say wriggly history, because it absolutely is associated with it has its own politics, because it is absolutely coming out of a tradition. It's informed by a tradition of performance art, and it is informed by a tradition and the practice of artists who are resisting the commercialization of art and the art market. It is also a field of practice, certainly in the way that the Live Art Development Agency talks about it, or has talked about it for the last 10, 20 years, as a field of practice which is especially, what's the way to say this, that has been particularly empowering to artists and communities of practice who've been excluded from conventional stages and spaces of representation. So there is a continuing claim on live art as a space of empowerment, I think, particularly for marginalized subjects of particular kinds. So we're talking about Black and global majority artists, disabled artists, queer artists, which is where a lot of my previous work is sort of focused. At the same time, there is this recognition that live art does have an institutional life, has become institutionalized. And so there is this sort of very conscious recognition of the problem of creating sustainable structures. I mean, maybe this sort of links a little bit to what we were talking about after the first paper of how do you create support structures for radical practice, which doesn't conservatize what you're doing, which doesn't create power structures, which create hierarchies. So a lot of what I think is important in the field of live art is a tradition of artist-led collectives and practices. And again, what's interesting about some of them, or a lot of them, is that the models are not easily reproduced, that there are principles you might draw from them, but very few of them offer a blueprint that you can take up. Two examples. So one, which is a historical one. So in Scotland, there is a sort of a series of galleries which are artist-run initiatives, and they nearly all come from the same generation of kind of artists who basically set up a committee structure. So you serve on the committee for a few years at a time, you volunteer your labor, and the committee functionally curates and programs the space, and at the end of your term you step down and another member of the artist community takes the place. And that has been an enormously successful model for decades, since the sort of the mid to late 60s. However, some of the major galleries which have been using that formula are now saying we need to step away from it, because the forms of free labor it depends on are no longer viable. So in the 80s and the 90s, there are lots of different forms of social support and economic benefits you could draw on to subsidize your volunteer labor to support those spaces. And now they just don't exist. So we have artists, particularly artists of Black and global majority heritage, who've now moved into leadership positions in those organizations, going, we don't have the structural privilege which would allow us to labor for free on those terms anymore. The other example, which is more performance-based, is Forest Fringe, who I mentioned in passing. Debbie Pearson, who I quoted, is the kind of founder of that, and she's the co-director with Andy Field and Ira Brand. And when they created the festival in the space of the Edinburgh Fringe as a kind of alternative space, and very quickly got a lot of interest from funding bodies and venues who wanted basically them to tell them, how do you do it? Like, what's the Forest Fringe formula? What's the secret? And you know, they were all kind of like quite upfront in kind of going, you want to pay me to come to your conference and talk about that? Yeah, I'll take your money, and I'm going to tell you that we don't have a formula that you can reproduce. This was an artist-led remedy to a series of structural problems. So if there's anything that you can do, you being organizations with money, is to empower artists to do the same. Because this isn't a thing that an organization can do. The only thing that you can do is clear space for artists and activists to do it. And I'm paraphrasing wildly what their position was, but yeah.
It's so important, isn't it? I mean, we like going back to like the first conversations, like if organizations try to claim that space, there's no room for anything else. I mean, it's a slight tangent, but I remember in the late 90s, I was asked to do some work in Lambeth, where the council's been failing for many, many years. And it was a thing around, imagine Lambeth was the idea, like, how do you imagine the future? And the big thing that came out is that they imagined that the council did not get its act together, because the council was just beginning to get its act together and starting to take over things. They were like, we don't want you to do that, because we are here in our full glory of community and voluntary sector organizations. And yeah, if they come in and take over the space, then that's really not helpful. And as we heard before, it's not even very effective. No. And yet now the context is so different, isn't it? So much precarious work and living around. To switch those organizations to saying, look, here's, you know, what do you want to do with this money, is quite a radical idea. Yeah,
I mean, I've seen, I'm part of, like, my project has been thinking about this sort of like structures of resilience or sustainability, which are where exploitation is guarded against, like in self-exploitation, which I think is like art sector and academic sector is like all the places we meet, our capacity for self-exploitation is right there in the middle. And there's the CCA, the Centre for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow, which was previously the Third Eye Centre, has a sort of a model they call kind of open source programming, and it came out of recognition they didn't have the resources to commission stuff in-house. So a lot of their program is developed with other organizations, arts organizations, but also activists and social organizations, basically working with them to develop and curate and program contents. And so one of the ways in which they've been able to carry on making really exciting work, I think, has been to sort of change their role in the process, has to kind of go, we're no longer in charge of it. We have to be collaborators. We're no longer exclusively in charge of it, maybe I should say. Yeah, that there's it's called, they describe it as open source programming.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Steve. Are there any other questions?
It looks like Zoran might have just joined us.
Oh, thank you very much for
which would be perfect timing. So
yeah, perfect. Zoran, are you hear us?
Thank you for those questions, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. Lovely presentation.
Yeah, it was great. I've noticed that Zoran's been coming in and out a lot, maybe unstable.
Oh no, maybe their connection is.
Yeah, I had, he sent me a message that he had some technical issues, and I'm trying to respond to him, but then it says he's not in the session, even though he shows on the panel. So there might be some, so we can use some time for more questions to Steve. Do you have, sorry, because I was also dealing with someone, maybe you have mentioned it, did you conduct artists interviews, or was it more an episode? And
yeah, so the project has been, there's Zoran coming back, and so the project involves archival research and artist interviews. So I've spoken to about 50 something artists so far, and those interviews in the process of being transcribed. And later this year, or the start of next, hopefully just later this year, that will be a new collection. It's an archive which is available online for people to access for research or for whatever their interest might be. So that's been the methodology of it, has been archives and interviews, and the process of that has been wildly reinvented at every turn, because none of it anticipated having to sit in this room for 90% of it. So
indeed. Oh,